Just a little background. The Smesny family, as well as all the Czech families from Eastgate, Crosby, and everywhere, came from the Czech lands of Bohemia and Moravia in Central Europe. And for most of their history, Bohemia and Moravia was under the control of mainly the Habsburg Empire of Austria. And Habsburg Austrians controlled pretty much all the German states until 1866, when Otto von Bismarck decided he had enough of Austrian interference in the North German states, so he picked a war with Austria, and the Prussians and the German states beat the Austrians. And so in 1867, the Hungarians threatened to leave the empire, that they were not given equal status with the Austrians. So in 1867, you had the Empire of Austria-Hungary. And a few years later, the Germans taught the French a lesson, and you had the German Empire was formed in 1871 after the Franco-Prussian War. And it was in the Empire of Austria-Hungary that the Smesny family left. Over a period of years, the whole family didn't come together. They came at different times, but the mother and brought some of her children over in 1912. I say it's a Czech family with German roots because this is what my Uncle Joe Smesny told me. The Smesny family originated from the village of Kostelic, and I'm going to butcher some of these Czech names, but I figure most people here is not going to know the difference. The Smesny family originated from the village of Kostelic, Stipa, in the Czech land of Moravia. Smesny family legend states that the patriarch of the Smesny family was a deserter of the Prussian military. Prussian, not Russian. He fled from the German kingdom of Prussia to escape the military authorities and settled in the Czech land of Moravia, which at that time was under Austrian domination. And the area they settled in was in southeastern Moravia, not far from the present Czech Republic's boundary with Slovakia, and just north of the border with Hungary. The local people took a liking to him, and so they hid him from the authorities. And I was told, and I saw this in a book that Chuck's grandmother had, that the family's German name was Turin. The name was changed to Smesny, which in Czech means comical or comedian, because they thought he was. So he married a local Moravian girl, and thus the Czech lineage of the Smesny family begins. So that's why it says a Czech family with German roots. And how do you turn that thing?
Well, let's hope I can do it.
Each quadriplegic.
Yeah. Okay, so one of the children born to this couple, and I don't know their names, they're out there somewhere, but I just don't have them. One of the children born to this couple is son Anton, and that's Anton right there. And in case you're wondering, if you translate Anton into English, it's Anthony. And Anton Smesny was born March the 25th, 1853 in Kostelic, Stipa, Moravia. In 1879, Anton married a young lady by the name of Aloysia Dudek. And Aloysia is Louise in English. They were married in the Panna Maria Catholic Church in the nearby village of Stipsky, as there was not a Catholic church in Kostelic. Aloysia Dudek was born in Kostelic on December the 6th, 1860. And this is Aloysia right here. And Chuck's grandmother, who I call Mary Smesny, said this was probably her mother, but no one is sure. 10 children would be born to this couple, 7 of which would live to maturity. Anton Smesny was a fireman in Kostelic. The story goes that one evening, Anton went to a local tavern with some of his co-workers and drank a few rounds of pivo, which I'm sure many of y'all know what pivo is, Czech word for beer. As he was on his way home, feeling happy, Anton slipped on the ice, fell to the ground, and lost consciousness. And he died on October the 26th, 1905, at the age of 52. One story I heard is that when they found him, his body was just frozen stiff. And Aunt Mary Smesny told me a lot of stuff. I had a lot of conversations with her. By that time, two of Anton and Lois Smesny's daughters had already left Moravia and settled in Texas. The story goes that John Pavlesek of Friedeck, Texas, had written the Smesny family that he needed the girls to help him on his farm. The oldest Smesny daughter, Philomena, and the youngest daughter, Frances, left their family in 1900 to go to Texas. In 1909, the oldest Smesny son, Frank, left Moravia to join his sisters in Texas. In 1912, Aloysia Smesny made the decision to take the rest of her family to Texas. She had her sons Theodore, Joby, and Ludwig, as well as her middle daughter Louise, and Louise's husband Joseph Rogel, and their two children, Hermina and Job, with her in Kostalik. Aloysia Smesny sold her home and property to Rudolph Smesny, who was a brother of Anton. The money from the sale enabled Aloysia to make the voyage to Texas. In a journal written by Aloysia's son-in-law, Joseph Rogel, he wrote that the Smesny and Rogel families bid farewell to their neighbors and kindred in Kostalik on the morning of March the 31st, 1912, and traveled by wagon to the railway station in Zlin, where they boarded a passenger train to Otrokovici. At Otrokovici, they boarded a train which took them to the north. On April the 1st, Joseph Rogel wrote that they went through a medical inspection at Ratibor, and the health officials held Theodore Smesny back because he showed signs of trachoma, which is a bacterial infection that affects the eyes and is contagious, and if it's not treated early, will cause blindness. Theodore Smesny returned to Kostalik, where he lived with his uncle Rudolph Smesny, but Theodore joined his family in Texas a year and a half later in the fall of 1913. On April the 3rd, 1912, Joseph Rogel wrote that they arrived in Bremen, Germany, where they again went through medical inspections. Joseph Rogel wrote what a beautiful city Bremen was. On the morning of April the 4th, the family traveled by train to the Bremen harbor, where they boarded the steamship SS Hanover. The family story was told that the family came to America on the steamship because Aloysia Smesny could not afford the fares for the entire family to come on a passenger ship. At noon, the siren of the steamship sounded, and the steamship started to move slowly out of the harbor. Thus began the family's voyage to America. Joseph Rogel wrote in his journal of the crowded and often unsanitary living conditions on the steamship, as well as the poor quality of the food. Many of the passengers lived off of food supplies that they brought with them. Seasickness was also a problem for the weaker passengers, especially during times of bad weather. Joby Smesny would tell his family years later, after a few days into their journey, one evening the whistles of a large ship could be heard, so everyone went on deck to see what ship it was. A quarter of a mile away was the RMS Titanic. The Titanic was, I didn't bring my glasses, so I was getting worried. The Titanic was moving at a fast speed, and it looked so bright and beautiful in the twilight that Joby and his brother Ludwig told their mother how much they wished they could be traveling on that beautiful new ship. They watched the ship until it disappeared into the horizon. The waves caused by the Titanic's wake caused a great deal of rocking on the Smesny steamship, the SS Hanover. Joseph Rogel wrote in his journal that on April the 12th at 8 a.m., the steamship Hanover received a telegraphic message to avoid one certain path since there was a big danger due to large icebergs. So the ship turned to the left, so it turned south. On the evening of April the 13th, a large iceberg could be seen from the steamship, and Joseph Rogel wrote that it was so large that it looked like a castle floating on the water. Joseph also recorded that the Hanover had received a message of help from the RMS Titanic as that ship was sinking. However, The Hanover was too far away to reach the Titanic in time. When news of the Titanic's sinking reached the Hanover, Aloysia Smesny said to her two young sons, Jovi and Ludwig, that they had better be glad they had not been on that big ship, or now they would be at the bottom of the ocean. On April the 17th, the Hanover approached the harbor of Philadelphia. More medical inspections followed after the steamship docked at Philadelphia, but the passengers stayed on board ship. The Hanover remained in Philadelphia's harbor until April the 20th, when it set sail for Galveston. Joseph Rogers wrote in his journal that as a ship passed the Florida Keys, that the island of Cuba could be seen in the distance. I just threw that in for special effect. The Hanover docked at the port of Galveston on April the 26th, 1912. The family stayed on board ship one more night. On the morning of April the 27th, more medical examinations came. Look at all the medical examinations that they went through just to come here. And now you see possible. In the immigration medical records, Aloysia Smesny's physical description was given as 5 feet 3 inches in height, with a fair complexion, blonde hair, and gray eyes. Aloysia Smesny named her son-in-law, Alois Pesca, as her contact in Texas, and gave their point of destination as Sealy, Texas. Afterward, the passengers gathered their possessions and passed through customs when the unthinkable happened. Aloysia Smesny was sitting in a room by herself when a man dressed as a police officer came in and told her in very fluent Czech that if she had any money or jewelry, that he would hold it for her or she would be taxed when she went through customs. Since he spoke Czech, Aloysia trusted him as a fellow countryman, so she gave him $300 in cash. After she went through customs, Aloysia went back to look for the man, but he was nowhere to be found. So, a very rough start in a new land. That was her money that was going to get her established in Texas. Joseph Rogers wrote that the family was met with a carriage by his 3 brothers-in-law, Frank Smesny, Alois Pesca, and Peter Yalloway. The family went to a hotel that belonged to Frantesic, and this is a 3-mile-long Czech name, so I'm not even going to say it. I'm just going to say they went to Frank's place, where they had lunch and a toast to their reunion. So I'm sure Aloysia Smesny did not feel much like celebrating. She just had $300 stolen from her. At 5 p.m., the family boarded a train in Galveston, and at 10 p.m., the family arrived in Sealy, where they were welcomed by Smesny daughters, Frances Pesca and Philomena Yalloway. They arrived at the Pesca home very late that night, but had to get up early the next morning to go work in the fields. The Pescas loaned Aloysia Smesny money with the agreement that Aloysia, Ludwig, and Joe V would help with the work on the farm. Young Ludwig and Joe V never chopped cotton before, and it didn't take long before they decided they wanted to go back to Europe. Joseph and Louise Smesny Rogel, who came with them from Europe in 1912, had moved to Beasley in Fort Bend County, so Aloysia Smesny, when she was able, rented a farm near Beasley, where she moved her sons, Jovi and Ludwig. Not being conditioned to the hot, humid climate of the Texas Gulf Coast and determined to pay back the money that had been loaned to her, Aloysia suffered a heat stroke from working in the fields continuously, which left her an invalid, and she later died as a result of complications from the stroke. Aloysia Dudek Smesny died in Beasley, Fort Bend County, Texas on March the 25th, 1914. So just 1 month short of being here 2 years. She was 53 years old. Aloysia was buried in the Sealy Catholic Cemetery in Sealy, Texas. This cemetery is known today as the Immaculate Conception Cemetery. Joe B. was not quite 15 years of age, and Ludwig was only 12 years of age at the time of their mother's death. The 2 boys tried to farm on their own, the land their mother had rented, but they later gave up and hired themselves out as farm hands. Okay. This is the family, Anton and Aloysia Dudek Smesny. So like I said, he was born March 25th, 1853, died October 26, 1905. Aloysia was born December 6, 1860, died March 25th, 1914. And they were the parents of 10 children. Their first daughter, Francesca, was less than a year old when she passed away in 1880. Philomena is the oldest daughter who survived. She married a widower, Peter Galloway. And Aloysia or Louis Smesny, she married in Europe, Joseph Rogel, in 1906. France or Frank Smesny, he died in 1965. He came in 1909. He married Pauline Zapolak in 1913. Marie Smesny and Anton Smesny both died in a diphtheria epidemic in Europe in 1895. Theodore or Ted Smesny married Marie Cervinka. We called him Papa Tio and Aunt Mary because their farm was right next to where we lived, our farm. And Joseph Wycliffe, Joe V., he married, his first wife was Aloysia Sodalak. She died less than a year after they married. And then he married Mary Rahunik. So to us, they were Grandpa Joe and Grandma Mary. And then Ludwig Smesny married Frances Scarpa. That's Felix's aunt. And also, she was an aunt to Miss Eileen Parker's first husband, Joe Hodgdick, because his mother was also a Scarpa. Frances Scarpa died in 1945, and Ludwig Smesny married Annie Hodgdick, who was also an aunt to Eileen Parker's husband, Joe Hodgdick. So, Uncle Ludwig must have really liked the Hodgdick family because he was determined to stay related to them. And his first wife was Mrs. Hodgdick's sister. His second wife was Mr. Hodgdick's sister. And these are the 7 siblings that came from Europe. This is Philomena Yalloway, the oldest sister. And she and her younger sister, Frances Pesca, came together in 1900. She married a widower who was 17 years older than she was. He had 5 children. They got married, they had 6 more children. So she had a household. And they lived in Colorado County and later in Orchard, which is just in northern Fort Bend County, just below the Austin County line. She spoke Czech, of course, that was her native language. She also was very fluent in German. I know that because that's what Mary Smesny told me. She came to Eastgate in 1949 when Uncle Joe and Aunt Marveline got married, and my great-grandmother, Anna Bode, came from her home up close to West in Central Texas to the wedding because Aunt Marveline was her oldest granddaughter and her first grandchild to get married. So, Aunt Philomena and my great-grandma Bode met at the wedding reception, and I heard that they had a lively conversation in German. And they all wondered, where did she learn to speak German? She told them, well, several of her neighbors had been German, so she learned the language. Miss Pesca here, she is the reason why the Smesnys came to Eastgate. Her husband was Alois Pesca, and his sister was Frances Smykel Pesca. And the Smykels came to Eastgate in the early years of the community's development. The Smykels were charter members of St. Anne's Catholic Church. So the Smykels came to Eastgate, the Pescas came, and Mrs. Pesca wrote letters to get 3 of her brothers to move to Eastgate too. So, all you Smesnys, if you see a Michael, give him a great big bear hug, because indirectly, they're responsible for y'all being here. And Mrs. Rogel, like I said, she married in Europe. She had 2 children born there, and she came with her mother in 1912, and she lived to be 100 years old. They lived in Beasley, Texas for 10 years. That's why her mother lived there. And then they later lived in Sealy, where she had her husband had a watch and shoe repair shop. He died in 1943, and she died in 1984, so she was widowed for 40 years. And just my observation, I think she was the daughter who was the most close to her mother. because when the other two sisters came, she said her mother needed her at home, so she stayed in Europe. And in fact, she's buried beside her mother in the Sealy Catholic Cemetery. And Frank Smesny was the only one of the brothers who did not come to Eastgate. He farmed around Friedeck and Sealy, and he died there in 1965. He's buried in the Sealy Catholic Cemetery. Back to Mrs. Pesca, they lived in Eastgate for several years. Then they moved to Houston, and then they moved to Crosby, where they settled. And these are the three brothers who came to Eastgate: Theodore, Jovi, and Ludwig. And so this is the family of Theodore Smesny. He was born September 24th, 1895. He died June 14th, 1977 in the Dayton Hospital. He married Marie Cervinka. She was born in 1902. She died at the age of 97 in 1999. And they're both buried at the St. Anne's Catholic Cemetery in Eastgate. And they were the parents of 8 children. Their first daughter, Aloysia, died when she was not quite a year old. And Mary was telling me about that child. She had been up with her for several nights, had very little sleep for several days, taking care of her. And she went to lay down and take a nap, and Uncle Ted came and told her that the baby had died. And she's buried at Rosenberg Cemetery. Joe J. Smesny married Doris Stanfield, and she was also, their family was living in Eastgate at that time. They had one daughter, Jolene, is that her name? Okay. And they lived in Dayton for several years before moving to Centerville, and then they moved to Highlands, Centerville or Madisonville. I always get those two bills messed up. And they're buried at the White Cemetery in Highlands. Raymond Smesny married Georgianne Yannick, and she worked at the bank in Crosby for several years. They lived in Crosby, had 2 sons, and a daughter that was stillborn. Anton Smesny is familiar to a lot of people here. He was born in 1928, died in 2022. He married Pearl Ballinger. Many people know Pearl. She worked for McGinney's Drugs for several years, and later at Brookshire Brothers Pharmacy. And Anton and Pearl are both buried at Magnolia Park over here. Mary Smesny married Gerald Wilkinson. They had 2 children, and they're both buried at St. Anne's Catholic Cemetery. Elizabeth or Betty Smesny married John Charles Fielder. All 5 of their kids went to school here in Dayton, and they're buried in St. Anne's Cemetery. Betty worked in the school cafeteria here in Dayton for several years. Georgia Smesny married Van May. Georgie's still alive. She lives in Crosby. Van died last year. He's buried in Huffman. Robert Smesny married Melba Stasny. They're both still alive, and they live in Crosby. Robert and my dad were close friends growing up. And what's so fascinating is that Theodore Smesny, they bought their farm in Eastgate the same day my grandpa and grandma Bode bought their farm, February 6, 1942. They all bought it from the Stosher family. And the Hannells bought their farm the same day as well. So I'm thinking the Stoshers must have owned that whole block, because the Theodore Smesnys, the Bodes, the Hannells, the Stanfields, the Flurries, and the Merricks were all living on that block at one time. And the Stanfields later sold their property to the Parks. The Flurries later sold their property to the Mansfields, who had a drugstore here. And the Mansfields sold theirs to the Leahs. And the Merricks sold their dairy farm to Ed Hahn. Ed Hahn later sold it to Mr. Self. And Mr. Self got tired of government interference in his dairy business, so he got out of the dairy business, divided his land up, and Eastgate's never been the same since. Okay, this is the Joe B. Smesny family. Joe B. was born in 1899. He died at his home in Eastgate in 1981. He married his first wife, Aloysia Sodalak, on November the 16th, 1920. They were only married 8 months when she died, and she was expecting a child too. at the time of her death. She's buried at the Catholic Cemetery in Sealy. And Mary Rahunick, she came in 1911. She came on the ship Brandenburg, and she worked as a governess for a wealthy family in Texas, in Sealy, before she and Grandpa Joe got married. So they had 7 children. Joe F. Smesny, Uncle Joe, married Aunt Marveline Bode in 1949. Their wedding was the first wedding in the present-day St. Anne's Catholic Church. They got married 2 days after the church was dedicated. And Uncle Joe told me that Miss Christine Janacek let them use all the flowers that was used in the dedication service for their wedding. So Uncle Joe said that all of Aunt Marveline's family, who came down from Central Texas for the wedding, thought that she was marrying a rich man because her mother's father was in the church. So that's Jim's mom and dad. There's also Cynthia, Dolly, Joey, Frankie, Sherry. And there's Jerry Smesny, married Josephine McMillan. And Jerry's buried in St. Anne's Cemetery. That's Anne Marie Smesny's parents. There's also 2 boys, Jerry Jr. and John. I don't really know them. And Louis Smesny married Maylene Benton. He's buried at St. Anne's Cemetery. Maylene lives here in Dayton. Amos Smesny, he sent me a lot of stuff. He just died 4 years ago. He married Nancy McWhorter. Amo is the only one not buried at St. Anne's. He's buried at Magnolia Park. Nancy lives in San Antonio. Lillian Smesny married Alvin Kulak. They live in Crosby. That's where all their kids went to school. They have 2 daughters that live here. Gail Mason lives in Lenny Creek, and Diane Virall lives out at Eastgate. And Eleanor Smesny married Thomas Lipon. They lived in Crosby, but Eleanor worked for Jack Hartell for several years in the Liberty County Courthouse. And then Molly Smesny, who was very close to our family, she married Johnny Hamill in 1956. And Aunt Molly died when she was 58 years old. Johnny Hamill just died about 3 months ago. And their daughter Connie is buried in between them in the St. Anne's Cemetery. And here's Ludwig Smesny. So he married Frances Scarpa on November the 9th, 1926. And his second wife was Annie Hodgdick. They were married in 1952. So Ludwig and his first wife had 5 children. When they graduated, they all left and moved on. But all their kids were born in Eastgate. All their kids went to Dayton schools. So Edwin and Albert were the 2 that lived close. They lived in Houston, although Edwin was living in Mont Bellevue when he passed away. He married June Stasny. She just died here this past April. And they're buried in Highlands. Henrietta Smesny married Jerome Ablati. They're buried in Edna, Texas. Albert Smesny was a really good guy. I really liked him. He's buried in Highlands. His wife is in a nursing home in Katy, I think. Max Smesny died, and he was in the military. And they lived all over, but they settled in Midlothian, Texas. His wife, Georgia, just died this past April, and that's Margie's sister. I met Georgia once. She was a very nice lady. And Edith Smesny is still alive. She lives in Baytown, Highlands, down there somewhere. And she married Thomas Yasick. He just died a couple of years ago. So Ludwig Smesny, he moved to Eastgate. His children were all born here. But in 1963, Ludwig and Annie Smesny sold their farm and moved back to Sealy. So their house is still standing. They bought that farm in 1940, Ludwig and Frances did. You're going down 1960, you go into the Grand Parkway, their house is the first house that's on the right. The Lampsons later bought that house. I don't know who has it now. But anyway. All right, now the Smesny family, it's y'all's turn. Speak up. This is y'all's family. Y'all share your memories. Anybody have anything to say?
You covered everything.
Yeah.